So omics, in this example, very quickly, and it's done in newborn screenings, gives you the opportunity to see, okay, this child, we need to start treatment right away. We know exactly what the issue is. Now, you can even go a bit forward, and again, that's a practice that's already happening in much of this region, and say, if two people want to get married, maybe they want to do premarital screening and check what are the chances that this might happen. By the way, it's about 40% if both parents are carriers, if I remember correctly. And again, this is an offer that has been around for a while. Or ultimately, and that's where we're getting to now, because we understand so well why this particular disease is happening, are there methods? And the famous genetic scissors, CRISPR, for example, is one of them where we can actually fix it. So omics start out with understanding, and then we can basically both go backwards and take action in order to prevent something, or move to a therapy with all the new technologies that are being developed on the basis of omics.
Welcome to the Health Beats podcast, brought to you by Abu Dhabi Global Healthcare Week. The Health Beats podcast series is your window into healthcare industry news making headlines and the role of Abu Dhabi and the UAE in unlocking global healthcare momentum. We give you insights into the future of the global healthcare sector and Abu Dhabi's contribution to it. I'm your host, Larissa Trakin, and in this week's episode, I'm joined by Claudia Palm, Senior Executive Advisor at Strategy and Middle East. We'll have a conversation called The Omics Revolution, Reshaping Healthcare in the GCC. Claudia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
Tell us about omics. What does omics stand for, and what does it represent in the evolution of healthcare?
Yeah, I think it's a buzzy term for something that in effect has always existed. So we speak of omics when we look at the study of basically all biological molecules within a cell or an organism. So within our cells, obviously we have DNA, we have RNA, proteins, lipids, all kinds of different molecules. And omics summarizes the study of these to understand how are they structured, what do they do, and how we could possibly manipulate and influence them if it's necessary.
Genomics. The other omics. Give genomics. Us a round of the omics fields now.
So genomics, I think, is the best known because that's basically what we've all understood about sequencing our DNA and the long lists of letters, A's, B's, etc. And what was really the big revolution of the 1990s when we were able to sequence our genome, and now increasingly we're actually doing whole genome sequencing in pretty fast arrays. On top of that, I think a lot of people have heard of epigenetics, epigenomics. The question is which genes are actually active or not. So they can be turned on or not. So that's the second layer. And the question is which instructions does our DNA give in terms of producing different molecules? So that would be messenger RNA, mRNA, well known since the pandemic. That is basically giving instructions to other parts of the cell or the organism in order to produce proteins, lipids, metabolomics, all these metabolites in this case, all of these different pieces that make up any living thing has all the elements, and they can vary with every individual, which is quite fascinating. So as you can imagine, that's a huge amount of data. And the term omics really came into being when we were starting to be able to collect and process this amount of data. It wouldn't have been possible before the data revolution, because there are giant servers, giant data amounts that not only you have to be able to collect and store, but then you have to make sense of it, which then gets us to right now the big revolution being artificial intelligence, algorithms that can make sense of it, that can make connections between million and million of data sets and hopefully help us understand and learn.
So these different discrete sciences, these omics, the genomics, epigenomics, many others, it seemed, if you count environmentomics, is that how you say it? But I was reading up on this, really anything that influences the way your cells behave? Is that fair?
Any kind of organism, actually. So it's obviously beyond people. It applies to plants and animals as well. But even within an organism, it would also apply to the DNA of a particular tumor, because tumors have their own DNA. So it's both in the whole organism or in discrete elements that we might want to study closer.
And so across all of those, the data gathered are now yielding new ways to intervene and to keep people healthy. So tell us about that.
They help us understand what actually happens, right? There's some situations and connections and diseases that we understand quite well. And then there are others that are so complex because so many elements contribute to it, where we still need to learn what's even happening. And you will, I'm sure, have heard that sometimes a doctor just can't tell you why is this? What exactly? It's just there, right? It's an observation to begin with. So the causalities are very much the subject of omics study, because only when we understand what molecule is interacting with what molecule, or what might be defective in a particular gene, or even just unusual in a gene, right? Not every difference is necessarily a defect. Can we start to come up with ways to potentially influence it? In the most extreme way, of course, in terms of actually changing genetic makeups and genes, or the instructions that our body gives in order to do a particular thing, or in much smaller ways, just to know, is there a particular behavior that might influence it? Of course, in order to translate it to things beyond the sheer mechanism within your body, you have to add even more data, because then you'll have to understand what's the lifestyle of a particular person, what kind of symptoms has he or she shown, what attempts have been made to treat it, and what outcomes has that produced. So you're actually feeding in even more, for lack of a better word, softer data, because it's much more to do with an individual person in order to understand the mechanisms and, have the agency to operate it.
Precisely why I imagine it makes medicine so personalized. And how does this change? Yeah. How does this change the whole practice of healthcare in an ideal world? I mean,
in an ideal world, of course, we would understand all of these things and know exactly what cause will require us which action and what outcomes we will generate. The reality is, in the past, much of it has been observation and ultimately statistics, right? That's when you see these data, these clinical studies say in X% of cases, this happens, in X% that. Sometimes we know why. So we've known for a long time that different phenotypes might influence how a particular medication works, or if it works for you at all. We also know that pretty much every treatment has a certain percentage of non-responders, and most of the time we don't know why. Why doesn't it work for this person? Omics has the potential, and it's already starting to come true, to say, we know because we've been able to sequence your DNA or just do a blood test and look at particular protein. We know this won't work for you. So we're not even going to try this treatment. No waste of money, hope, time. Because, you're not the right candidate. We're going to go with something else. So ideally, and this is already happening, right? About 2/3 of all drugs in the pipeline these days have what we call companion diagnostics. So in order to choose a particular medication, treatment, etc., you would first check on some biomarker molecule, do a test, send something to the lab, in order to understand how high are the chances that this will actually be effective and the right thing. And of course, hopefully that makes outcomes much better for everyone, and even just the process much less hit and miss as we have now sometimes.
How do you see omics technologies transforming healthcare here in the GCC region, where you have a prevalence of diseases like diabetes or genetic disorders? How do these two combine?
Well, genetic disease, of course, is more or less the poster case for omics, right? Genetic disease is really something within the makeup of your DNA that has a particular impact on your health. maybe an example that is quite common in this geography and a few others, very common, is sickle cell disease or beta thalassemia, which are actually linked to a single defective gene, which is very unusual, by the way. But here we know exactly, if you're born with this gene, you have to inherit it from both your parents. Unfortunately, you have this disease. So omics, in this example, very quickly, and it's done in newborn screenings, gives you the opportunity to see, okay, this child, we need to start treatment right away. We know exactly what the issue is. Now, you can even go a bit forward, and again, that's a practice that's already happening in much of this region, and say, if two people want to get married, maybe they want to do premarital screening and check what are the chances that this might happen. By the way, it's about 40% if both parents are carriers, if I remember correctly. And again, this is an offer that has been around for a while. Or ultimately, and that's where we're getting to now, because we understand so well why this particular disease is happening, are there methods? And the famous genetic scissors, CRISPR, for example, is one of them, where we can actually fix it. So omics start out with understanding, and then we can basically both go backwards and take action in order to prevent something, or move to a therapy with all the new technologies that are being developed on the basis of omics. Now, this is a bit of a simple example because, as mentioned before, it's very, very rare that disease is only linked to one gene. So most of the time, unfortunately, interestingly, we have to look at multiple causes, multiple factors, which of course is a bit more challenging in terms of then determining the right course of action. But for genetic disease, the promise is immense and the possibilities are immense. You could imagine, besides the premarital screening, obviously increase the number of things you test for in this. You could imagine preventive screenings when, as a lot of people in the world already do, when your parents have had particular diseases, maybe you want to know early on and see if you can take any kind of interventions to prevent it. Breast cancer is a very common example for that. Or, we can start, and there's a number of activities here in the region, we can start trying to develop those fixes, those therapies, and also prepare and equip the healthcare systems to both do that diagnostic work, but then ultimately also offer the therapies when they become available.
And how about diabetes? What can be done?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Diabetes, I think the guess is that we're talking 16, 17, or even more genes that might be involved, because there is a genetic component. Obviously, there's the lifestyle element in terms of nutrition, etc. So here you really have to look at all pieces of the puzzle, and it requires not only the initial understanding that you might be at risk, but then basically lifelong action. Having said that, there's more and more look at maybe not genetic treatments, but cell-based treatments in order to help the pancreatic cells, which of course is what in diabetes doesn't operate as good as you would like it to help them live up to their task again, for lack of a better word, become more productive, become more effective, maybe even engineer new pancreatic cells. So there's, in this particular case, it's a bit of a different therapeutic approach in coming from what is not operating correctly rather than the genetic disposition you might have. And these things are in the pipeline. Will take a few more years, but it's going to be very interesting to see.
Claudia, you've been in life sciences for a long time. You've been involved in the GCC zone development of this sphere for a long time, and you've watched these major investments that have been made into healthcare, into infrastructure here. How can those now dovetail with what's happening in omics?
So there's been a really impressive activity so I've been in the Gulf since 2012, I think, and activity has really scaled up on this side, R&D, over the past 5 years, I would say. If you look at things in particular in Abu Dhabi, the Emirati Genome Project, the activities of M42 in terms of the database, because we're talking both about the front end, so the actual interaction with people and patients, which is relevant. First of all, you have to collect the data you want to do research with, right? So you need to motivate large pools of people to provide information, like having the genome sequence, providing maybe in samples, blood samples. Biobanks have been a big discussion and how to build them out. Then in treatment itself, be equipped in the healthcare facilities to actually do the necessary testing or sequencing when someone has a symptom or a disease, and then also be able to act on it. But you also need the background piece of saying, okay, if I have this data, who's doing the research? How are we doing the research? How can we build up the universities, potential labs, attract? Biotech is an industry that is very much driven by small startup companies, usually spin-off from universities. So that's a field that you really want to seed and push in the region, in the Gulf region. But also there's a technical backbone and infrastructure that has been invested in, both in the Emirates and Saudi and some others, because these are huge data centers that need to be not just built and maintained, but you also want to make sure that they're absolutely safe. So cybersecurity is a huge topic, of course. And you need to make sure that there's actually the technical capability there to work with this data, as mentioned before, artificial intelligence, algorithms, smart ways to make sense of things. It's a giant effort, and several of the GCC members mentioned Abu Dhabi is noteworthy. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been pushing it, are really trying to drive both putting the infrastructure in place and creating, all of the quote unquote human pieces of the picture, the researchers, the capital, the venture capital. You need to do this research, all of the factors that would be essential in an ecosystem for Omics.
When you're talking about an R&D ecosystem by design, and that's very interesting because it is obviously it's purpose-built to generate breakthroughs, to generate applications as quickly as possible. But one thing that's come up in other episodes of this podcast is, especially here in the GCC, certainly here in the UAE, there's a real community feel when you're talking about population health, community health. There is a solidarity, there's a certain social fabric that's running alongside this push toward breakthroughs, towards resolving certain genetic disorders, etc. How does that make this region unique? When it comes to the data piece in particular, how does this region represent a unique opportunity or face unique challenges when it comes to data collection, privacy, and utilization of data for omics? It's a very unique atmosphere, and I want to understand, especially on a global perspective, how different and how unique it is.
So there are several factors. I mean, it starts out with that the local population, in the sense of the citizens of the Gulf, are, compared to other parts of the world, are quite homogenic in their makeup. Historically speaking, it's been more isolated populations than you would have, for example, in Europe. So they've developed a rather specific set of biological characteristics. So their DNA has particular characteristics, etc., and you have this homogeneity in the group. That makes them very, very interesting for research, to have that pool. And it's a pool of data and characteristics that has been underserved so far in global research. So there has not been enough representation of this group, which again will make a lot of also outside research organizations and companies interested in exploiting that data because it will add to their more complete picture. You also have a very diverse expert population, though. So in a way, you can do both. You can look at very homogeneous populations, and you can look at a set of very different phenotypes and characteristics. The essential piece here is, how do you create that data pool, as you're saying? So the local population has been very engaged in the Emirates, for example, in the Emirati Genome Project. There's been, I think, at least 500,000 genomes sequenced. So as you're saying, that community spirit, that interest to create your own standalone pool and understanding of local characteristics. But if you want to add to that, if you would want to add data from experts, etc., things get very complex, of course. For one thing, on the scientific side, because then you have to really make sure that you're characterizing the right things and that you're collecting the right data. On the other hand, and you spoke of that, in the legal constructs that are necessary. So data privacy, I think, has been much debated all over the world in the field of medical science and research. And to cut to the chase, in my view, no one has come up with a perfect solution in terms of how to regulate the question of collecting data. So in collecting data, you want to have what we call informed consent. You want to be sure that the people who are providing the data know exactly what they're doing. They agree to it. They understand what will be done with it, who can use it, and that has legal validity. So the region, the different countries in the region have been working on creating that infrastructure of even defining the rules. For an expat, though, for a European, in my case, GDPR would apply. Even though I live here, the European regulation actually applies to me, protects me. So there's multiple legal principles that come to bear. Overall, the Gulf has tried to find a very pragmatic, practical way between the very restrictive, some people say, European view of privacy, and on the other end of the spectrum, the much more flexible use of the US, in order to say, obviously, we want to have people's data protected, but we don't want to make it impossible to do this research and have people have access. So I think this is a step-by-step process. You start out with a set of rules, you try them out, and then you have to be flexible enough to make adaptations, which I think the European Parliament is actually in the process of doing right now. So it's a very dynamic thing on the privacy, and it will continue. I mean, I spoke about cybersecurity. There are technical requirements, of course, that need to be in place, and given the advancement of hacking and other techniques, again, this is a constantly learning process.
It's very dynamic. And much comes down, I think, to the motivation of governments to find these scientific breakthroughs. How keen are they to have their communities benefit as well from where the science is going? That seems to be a major driver.
It absolutely is. In the population genome projects, and I spoke of the Emirates have a genome project, Saudi has a genome project, but they've also been operated in the rest of the world. I think the most complete database is Iceland. It's not so difficult when you have 300,000 citizens. But also the UK genome project has gotten a lot of attention. Japan, again, as so many things, everyone is trying things because it's never been done before. And in order to learn what is the best way. So one essential point, I think a point of debate here in the region is, in order to get the maximum benefit out of data you collect, you want to know what you're looking for before you collect it. Right? You want to have a research question. Are you going to basically collect data from everyone or are you looking for people who already have a particular disease, or members in their family have a particular disease? And then will you possibly be able to track them over the next few years, what we call longitudinal data, in order to see what happens to them over that time? Is that disease, if you're someone in your family has had it, will you actually develop it or not? What kind of factors are influencing this? So the research question is essential in order to know what you're looking for. And then the ability to add even more data to it beyond the world of omics, which is where a lot of the structures the governments here have built over the last few years come in. So electronic health records, of course, are a huge benefit in this kind of research, because you can try and link, even in an anonymized way, not necessarily with a person, but you can try and link records either on an empirical basis or an individual basis in order to understand these connections. If you don't have that infrastructure, and many countries in other parts of the world, and I include Europe, don't have that digital infrastructure, don't have complete electronic health records at this point in time, you are not able to do it. And I think that's quite unique. It's very unique and very, very exciting also for the private sector in this part of the world, that this effort to put the digital backbone in has been made and is continuously progressing.
Which then enables the R&D ecosystem, which then enables the breakthroughs, the IP, and so much else, the applications faster,
Absolutely.
One would presume. We're almost out of time, but I want to make sure to ask you about public-private partnerships, the role and the shape you see them taking in the GCC in order to enable all of this work in omics to really take shape and to impact the reality of healthcare for people. Where do you see PPP?
Personally, and again, I think there's a long debate about it, because biotech has been an industry where there's actually been quite a bit of government activity. If you think of the example of Singapore over the last 15 years, basically, with a concerted effort. Personally, I think this industry needs the private sector. That you cannot do this completely state-driven, starting with it's too expensive. Like, there's just not the resources and the funds that it could be completely covered by government. Having said that, there are essential pieces that depend on government, right? Starting with the healthcare systems. If this is what a public healthcare system is, what primarily takes over people's day-to-day healthcare, then it's essentially in creating that data pool we just spoke of. But it's also very important in order to enable interventions. I mean, your doctors need to understand which data they need to collect, how they need to process them, what conclusions to draw from them. There's new roles you have to create. I mentioned yet, by very important genetic counselors. It's like if you have to give people information that might be difficult to process and work with, you're creating entirely new job descriptions. Ultimately, and government is really in a position to enable these roles and these new specialties. And then you want to have the infrastructure to treat them. If you want to do CRISPR, you need to have a particular set of tests. So one challenge about 10 years ago in the region has been that particular tests couldn't be done here, but had to be sent to other countries in Europe or even further away in order to have a particular test. So you want to be able to really have state-of-the-art facilities and offer this. Having said that, research in the end comes from entrepreneurial spark and drive and funding, which gets us back to venture capital. So when you look into the big biotech hubs in the rest of the world, Boston is bigger than anything else on the planet, but also Cambridge or Munich or now Singapore. Much of the really interesting ideas come from tiny companies, 2 people, 4 people, 6 people, who found, students who found something in their PhD work that they found interesting and got some uncle to give them the initial amount of money and just keep going with venture capital. And the role of the government for this to happen here, and is really enable both the legal basis for these very innovative companies, many of which will fail. We have to be very realistic about that. The risk of basically shutting down biotech is massive. The benefit is still there because you still learn something, even if the company didn't work. So
the capacities, the infrastructure.
The legal infrastructure. There needs to be a funding environment combined with public grants, which you see everywhere in the world. The NIH in the US, I think, has a 30 billion plus budget per year, but also added to that private sector venture capital that flows into these entities and really makes this a lively and dynamic environment to create innovation, which in the end is what Omics is all about. I think it's a great platform to bring people together within the region and beyond the region around the topics we've been discussing. So I think there's a big R&D piece that would be perfect to dive into. Take the local universities here and their existing partners already in the rest of the world, but add to these partnerships. Medical research is an extremely collaborative field. So the more, the better. It's not, I do one thing, you have to do another thing. On the contrary, it really, any additional participant adds to the pool and the opportunity. So I think there's a piece around like how can we at the conference foster and enhance the partnerships of R&D entities, universities, and others beyond the region. Bring in the big names from the rest of the world. Create specific projects, for example, around diabetes, around genetic disease that is particularly prevalent here. Take someone like the Scripps Institute in San Diego, which there's been contacts with from the regions, which are very interested to be active. So is the conference something that can really connect these different pieces and have people start from there? I think it would be also a great forum to have a debate around the legal questions. Again, no one in the world has completely figured it out. And I think the opportunity here that much of the regulation was developed from scratch to a degree, taking inspiration from what others have done, but without necessarily being burdened down by particular perceptions in society, etc. So I think that's another, could be a very interesting forum for a lot of legal experts here in the region to participate in. I think there's a third interesting question is we're saying you have to motivate people to participate, right? This only works if a society, a community agrees that this is what we should be doing and they're willing to provide their data and work within these research questions. So is the conference maybe a tool, or could it be to really inform the public and bring the public into this omics revolution, as you're calling it? Is like saying, how can we appeal to them? How can we make it more accessible of what things can be done and what their role could be in it? I think that would be very exciting to explore.
Very concrete and very helpful ideas for collaboration. And thank you for all of your time today, Claudia Palm, Senior Executive Advisor at Strategy and Middle East. Thank you for joining us on Health Beats Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Health Beats Podcast. For more healthcare industry news, visit the Abu Dhabi Global Healthcare Week newsletter. The link is in our bio. Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, and continue to follow Health Beats by Abu Dhabi Global Healthcare Week for your global healthcare industry digest.